All right. So I probably will not focus so much on patronage, but I will talk a bit about governance as we go along. But how I've decided to approach today was to talk about certain concepts that I think might be something appealing or something relatable to the public when we talk about Haze. Basically drawing attention to what has been some of the interesting trends that I've seen observing Haze for the past 15 years. Of how it's been talked about in the media and how we can relate things to certain international relations concepts and certain political science concepts that could probably help to substantiate some of the stories that you might think of doing. So one angle that I felt was quite interesting was actually on, just give me a minute, I want to try and put my timer so I won't go over. Was actually on whether we think about these kind of things as crimes. Or environment pollution, is it thought about as a crime today? Because that's not actually something that is 100% accepted. The idea of an environmental problem, is it a crime or not? So I'm going to look at it from the context of human dignity and human rights, and we can see what important concepts could be related to this. So the idea of whether humans have a right to a healthy environment, this might seem quite obvious to you, but actually it is not recognized as much as you think. So this idea that the environment is a prerequisite to the enjoyment of human rights. If you think about it, what is human rights about? The right to live a good and comfortable life, basically. But of course, you would need to have a good environment to do so. So we talked about the effects of haze and how haze is one of the, or air pollution being one of the major killers and major easily avoidable killers. So obviously, haze would be, in a way, cutting into our rights as human beings. So related to this idea of environmental rights, there's things like the right to a safe, healthy, and ecologically well-balanced environment. So whether or not this should be recognized as a human right. And also when you think about it, certain other human rights, for example, access to information, participation in decision-making, access to justice, all this is actually dependent on having a good environment. So without that, we are blocked from accessing other rights as well. So the environment is really essential for us to have a healthy human rights ecosystem. So the whole idea about linking human rights and human well-being to the environment, we could argue that it started out in 1972 with the Stockholm Declaration. And together with the Rio Declaration down the road, it kind of brought about this understanding that, that governments need to somehow take care of their people, and not only their people, the people around the world as well. So the concept that it gave rise to this international law concept that goes along the lines of whatever happens in your country, you have to make sure that it does not cause harm to another country. So this is where we start thinking about this responsibilities in relation to transboundary pollution and the responsibilities that come with it from one country to the other. So if you look at the UN, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, Article 3 mentions that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. But it doesn't actually mention environment per se directly. And if you look at the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, I think, because it's in an earlier, or rather in a more recent environment, if you can call that, there has been more of an acceptance of this concept of environment being part of the human rights. So the Article 28F states that the humans or ASEAN people of ASEAN have the right to a safe, clean, and sustainable environment as well. And we have other related declarations that go along these lines. For example, the Singapore Resolution on Environmental Sustainability and Climate Change. The Common Stand on UNCED as well in 1992, they all recognize the importance of environment for human rights. So interestingly, this has also become you can see it in a few in constitutions around the world. If you look at the Malaysian constitution, it's not there. Malaysia does not mention anything about the environment in their constitution. It does say something about the right to life, but not particularly the environment. But interestingly, Indonesia has this in its constitution. So every person should have the right to live in physical and spiritual prosperity, to have a home and to enjoy a good and healthy environment. So this is in the Constitution of Indonesia. So it would be an interesting thing for all of you to go back and have a look at your own constitutions to see what do they say, or do they say anything about the environment. So this is a quote that I have gathered. Now I'll be showing you some quotes that I've gathered over the years, which I thought was quite interesting and connects to this idea about human rights and crime. So this is something by the former Singapore Environment Minister, Vivian Balakrishnan. And now he's he said this is not a natural disaster. So this was in relation to Haze. This is vandalism against society, against the environment, and ultimately against ourselves, a man-made tragedy and a crime. So is this an interesting comparison to natural disasters? Because he talks about this is not a natural, he makes it a different thing. He said, we're not talking about, let's say, typhoons, or we're not talking about earthquakes, talking about something that's not natural. So that's why he made the relation to crime. So I think this was a very important statement to make, because a lot of people still may not be able to understand that haze is actually something that is not necessarily natural. And of course, the severity of the haze depends on the weather. If you have a dry year, like if you have a bad El Nino year, the haze is worse. If you have a La Nina, it becomes less. But the essential drivers are not natural. The extent would depend on these atmospheric rhythms, but the drivers are still very much human, as we'll go into a bit more. And there has been other commentators describing this as the biggest environmental crime of the 21st century. So we've talked, the other speakers have talked about the orangutans and all this. And of course, the link to climate change has been made as well. I think something really easy for us to envision how much actually Surin has mentioned when peat is dried and exposed, it starts the process of CO2 being released, and that is where a country like Indonesia, for example, which doesn't really have much industrial contribution to CO2, because the biggest contributors are US, China, which are mainly industry. But a country like Indonesia or Malaysia, we could be contributing so much through just exposure and depletion of our carbon sinks. So that is really turning its head on this idea about industrialization driving climate change. Moving on, so this is not something that's only being said by other countries, like for example, if Singapore would say it, or if Malaysia would say it, or Thailand would say it. That hasn't been the case. We also see commentators and even government officials from Indonesia has been using this kind of language to describe what has been happening. So this is somebody from the Badan Nasional Penanggulangan Bencana. So I think it's like Natural Disaster Agency. So he has described it as a crime against humanity of extraordinary proportions. But when you think about it, actually, the people who are closest to the fires, they are the ones who suffer the most. So it's quite stark to see that the people we may face haze in Malaysia, but the people who are really the most affected are those in Sumatra or Kalimantan, who are really just next to it. So back to this concept about a crime against humanity. So if you look at the definition under customary international law, this has been used to describe things like slavery, apartheid, rape, sexual violence, this kind of stuff. So it basically means acts that are deliberate. They are deliberately committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed on any civilian population during peace or war. But when you think about it, actually, should we start considering environmental crimes as such? Because if you think about it, environmental crimes, they are caused by, most of the time, human activities, whether direct or indirect. And we know what we are doing. Human beings know what we are doing. So, sort of understanding it this way makes it really something that to kind of communicate the urgency and the need to really start thinking about this as a real big issue and not just a side effect of development. Just a side story, we ran a survey before to ask something along the lines of, is a certain amount of environmental pollution acceptable, an acceptable payment or an acceptable side effect of development in KL? And the surprising thing was I think it was like 30 to 40% actually said yes. So, this is something that perhaps we have to start thinking about how society understands environment and development, right? So if you don't think this is something, it's just a big problem and it's something that you just have to deal with as a developing country. So this is a picture about I think a very arresting picture of an entire, mountain on fire in Chiang Mai. And I have a good friend who lives there, and so it's really, when you just look at it, it's terrible. And this is not even on peatlands, right? It's in Thailand, and it just shows that, again, it's not just a southern problem. It also happens in the Mekong area, and it's equally, just as bad or even worse than what we have here. So definitely the people of Chiang Mai, what are their rights, right? And coming back a bit to Indonesia, these are some figures of what were the human costs of Haze. And what I do want to call your attention to is the 19 deaths at the top. So this was actually caused some controversy at the time because around the time where these figures were released, a few years later, scientists had done some research, and they actually said that these 19 deaths are super, super underreported. And they said that the actual range of deaths related to the 2015 Haze was about 40 to 100,000 deaths. Not 40 to 100, 40 to 100,000. So we can see here that there's a lot of underreporting going on. And the reason why the figures were so small, the official figures, was because these figures were the people who officially dropped dead during the Haze due to lung issues. So, of course, that would have been probably 19, fair enough. Those people who also were close by to the Haze. But when you take other considerations, people who were sick before became extremely sick because of the Haze and died later, for example, or people who started to get sick because of the Haze and had problems following that even beyond the Haze season. Taking all those into account, there's a much bigger number of effect onto the human well-being and the impact. And that study actually covered not only Indonesia, but also Malaysia and Singapore as well. So the effects are really quite broad. This is a picture which perhaps you would have seen taken during the 2019 Haze in Riau. And I think you guys will remember the red sky phenomenon in Riau. And actually, just to mention, I was in Sydney for a few years for my studies, and there was one day that I woke up to exactly this as well, a red sky in Sydney. So you may not think that this happens elsewhere, but it does as well, and it happened before. This happened in Riau. So it just shows how much of an impact it can have. And Sydney at the time, they were having their own wildfires as well. So basically, where are our rights to a good and healthy environment, and most importantly, who should uphold these rights? And back to the quote of the person from the National Natural Disaster Agency. So he made this statement before, saying that 99% of these fires are lit intentionally. So the question comes, are they deliberate, and to what extent are they deliberate? And I must say that this quote was taken about 2015, and I think things have changed on the ground a lot. So like what Surin has talked about. And I want to call your attention a bit to this question about intentionality in the fires and how we can interpret that. And I think there's a lot of avenue for sort of investigative journalism in this problem, because a lot of things are developing, a lot of things are changing on the ground, a lot of patterns on the ground is shifting, and I think it's very important for us to dig down and for you guys to dig down as journalists to get the real story. So if we look back at the definitions of the crimes against humanity, The definition as well is sometimes it can be part of government policy or wide practices of atrocities tolerated or condoned by a government. So we see that there's a bit of responsibility, or there's quite a bit of responsibility put on the government. And this is where I want to bring in governance issues. And I want to talk a bit about what Surin has also touched on, about peat drainage and about how things have changed. So indeed, in the past, before pre-RSPO, companies would have been burning, and that was acknowledged a long time ago. However, once people started to realize, once there were a lot of media exposure about this, people getting angry at the companies, a lot of these big companies have stopped doing it because they just can't afford to have the bad publicity attached to it. So there's been a lot of change. As Surin has said, a lot of these companies have adopted RSPO. RSPO doesn't allow you to burn. RSPO doesn't allow new plantings on peat. But the key here is that the key is still peat. Why I say that is because these companies, they establish themselves on peat. And, one cycle of palm oil is like 20-25 years. And they are there. The very fact that you are on peat makes it very fire prone. There's no two ways around it. If you are there, it means you are just contributing to the risk. So companies, usually they have a lot of money to maintain. They have their fire engine, firefighting teams, and they have their people, the engineers, to monitor the water levels and all that. But the problem is that peat domes are usually very large. So you can see this image here, because the reason why I showed this, which is the same one that I believe that Surin has shown, is that even though you see that the ditches have been dug only on the left side, you will see that eventually the whole peat dome becomes dry and drained, and the whole peat dome becomes destroyed. So this is one of the problems of governance that was in the past with Indonesia and even with Malaysia. Peat ecosystems were not considered a unitary ecosystem. So you would have situations where plantations were given land on, let's say, half the peat dome, and they would take care of it relatively well. But then you would have this interesting thing where you would have fires just outside the plantations. So why is that happening? That is because the peat dome is such a way that even though when you drain one side, the other parts get dry as well. So you would have these fires that are outside the plantations, or you would have villagers who are living around the plantations. They're just trying to grow their plants and their crops and all that. But something happens there, and because the land is already dry, because of the drainage that had occurred, the fire starts. So because of that, there's a lot of indirect effect. And so I think this is something that we need to understand. So when I went for my field work, something really interesting that I found was that villagers who were living close to plantations, they actually complained, and they said because the plantations are taking care of their water levels in their plantations so well, the villagers don't have enough water during the dry season because all the water is stuck in the plantations because they don't want the fire to occur there. So there's all of these knock-on effects. And the fact still remains that a lot of these plantations have been there and are going to be there for a long time. And because of that, these are things that you have to actually go and talk to people to find out the real story. It's not just a straightforward story of somebody lighting a fire. There's a lot of these other stories as well. And when a plantation is established, people will come. The roads are built. If the peatland was not open, nobody would even go there. So it's all about the pros and cons about opening up and then managing it, or just not opening it up at all. And that's what I think continues to be a problem. And yeah, so this is just, how it looks like. Currently, Indonesia is moving towards a hydrological unit way of governing peatlands. And this is, I think, on the right direction, because what it means is they're not going to start giving out like half of, the dome has to be managed as a whole, not just partly. So they're moving towards better forms of management. And I know I'm running a bit out of time, so I'll try and go a bit faster. So, these are some of the laws that exist in Indonesia. For example, fires are not allowed to. It's an environmental crime, basically. It's in the law. However, if you see recently the omnibus law that everybody talks about, it removes the strict liability sort of concept, which means that if a fire is in your land, you are automatically responsible for it. So it softens it. It doesn't remove it entirely, but it softens it. So it's kind of a rollback of trying to get people to be more responsible of taking care of their land. So that could be that is not a very good sign, but there are also good things. Like for example, like I said, the hydrological unit thing is being strengthened. So this is also another statement that was in the Constitution of the Republic of Indonesia: the land, the waters, and the natural resources within the state, under the power of the state, should be used to the greatest benefit of the people. So just to point this out, the state should be responsible for the well-being of the people. So I think that's really important to think about when states, they are interested in development. They want to make sure that they develop, GDP and stuff, but states must also remember that the people without the people, they are nowhere, right? So this comes back to the idea of human rights. And Pak Larry has touched on this, so I won't anymore, but just sort of the transboundary perspective, which is my last slide, is that basically, like Surin has mentioned, the politics of it all, the simplicity, when people don't look at the complexity behind it, it makes it also difficult for countries to react properly. So like if everybody is just saying, oh, palm oil is bad, for example, it makes it very difficult for Indonesia and Malaysia to take responsibility, because they might say like, oh, if I say yes, there has been some fires, then it's going to be bad for my country, So it makes it difficult for countries to also make statements and make decisions because people just understand things in black and white. And so countries really have to think about, what will happen to my industry? What will happen to things like this when they make decisions? So I think it's very important to look at the bigger picture and try to get deeper in, and not just things in black and white. So for example, this is a quote just very recently, when talking about the link from fires to palm oil. Of course, fires don't occur. I mean, palm oil plantations don't generally use fire nowadays. But like I said, there are indirect ways, but these ways are not talked about because they're just so scared. Indonesia and Malaysia are just so scared that it will make it worse for the palm oil industry. So things are just trying to be depoliticized so much that it becomes really bad to even move forward. I wanted to talk a bit about the Transboundary Haze Pollution Act, which was already touched on, if I'm not mistaken, but this is an example of criminalizing haze because it literally creates a law to say that if you create haze in Singapore, we can go after you using the law. So this is an example of it. It hasn't been able to be used effectively, but this is just an example of a country trying to really criminalize a violation of human rights. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.